The secret my father took when he escaped to America. I never questioned my father's stories about coming to America. He arrived in Chicago in 1962, 23 years old, with nothing but a worn suitcase and broken English. He'd tell us he left Poland because there was no future there, that he came here to build something better for himself. Mom would nod along, adding how brave he was to leave everything behind and start over. For 60 years, I believed every single word. My name is Carol, and I'm 60 years old. 3 months ago, my mother passed away at 89, leaving behind a house packed with memories in our old Polish neighborhood on Chicago's North Side. Dad had been gone for 12 years already, and now it was up to me to sort through a lifetime of belongings that told the story of our family. The house felt so empty without her gentle presence. The attic was cramped and stuffy, filled with cardboard boxes my parents had been moving around for decades without ever actually opening. Christmas decorations we'd stopped using, old clothes that went out of style before I was born, and furniture they couldn't bear to throw away, but never had room to display. In the far corner, tucked away behind a rack of Mom's old Sunday dresses, I spotted something I'd never seen before. An old wooden trunk, dark with age, with tarnished metal corners and a heavy brass lock that hung open, like it was waiting for me to find it. The whole thing looked European, old-fashioned in a way that seemed to belong to another time entirely. I dragged that heavy trunk into the dusty light and lifted the creaky lid. Inside, wrapped carefully in yellowed tissue paper, were thick bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. The paper felt fragile between my fingers, ready to crumble, and the ink had turned a soft brown with age. But what stopped me cold was the handwriting. It definitely wasn't English, and it didn't look like any language I'd ever seen. Beneath those letters were photographs. Black and white pictures of people I'd never laid eyes on. A young woman holding a baby, group shots of families gathered around dinner tables, and several photos of a man who looked remarkably like my father, but younger than I'd ever known him to be. In one particular photo, he had his arm wrapped around the same woman from the baby picture, both of them beaming at the camera with such happiness. It took my breath away. My hands started shaking as I picked up one of the letter bundles. The return address, written in that same careful script, showed a name that meant nothing to me. Anna Kowalski, with an address in Krakow, Poland. The postmarks were all from the 1960s, right around the time Dad would have been settling into his new life here in America. I'd taken 4 years of Spanish in high school and picked up enough German to get by during a trip to Europe with my husband. But this looked like Polish, and if these letters were hidden away in my parents' attic, they had to be important. Dad rarely talked about Poland, beyond the basic facts about why he left. He'd never once mentioned knowing anyone specific there, certainly not well enough to be exchanging letters with them. That evening, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Kowalczyk, whose family had also immigrated from Poland around the same time as Dad. She was in her 80s, but sharp as a tack, and she'd offered to help with anything I needed while settling Mom's estate. Her worn voice always reminded me of my own mother. I explained that I'd found some old letters written in Polish up in my parents' attic, and asked if she might be able to help me understand what they said. Without hesitation, she told me to bring them over the next morning. She glanced at me, then back at the letter, then at me again with a look I couldn't quite read. Finally, she asked if I was absolutely certain I wanted to hear what these letters said. When I pressed her about what she meant, Mrs. Kowalczyk took a deep breath and explained that the first letter was from a woman named Anna, writing to someone called Józef, which would be Joseph in English. She was asking when he was coming home, saying that little Tomasz missed his papa something terrible. My father's name was Joseph. In Polish, that would be Józef. Mrs. Kowalczyk continued, telling me that Anna mentioned it had been 8 months since he left for America for work, and she was struggling to make ends meet on her own. She wrote that the boy asked every single day when Daddy was coming home from building houses in America. The room seemed to tilt around me. I asked Mrs. Kowalczyk what date was on that letter, and my heart nearly stopped when she said March 1963. She offered to read the second letter, and I nodded even though I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever came next. This letter was dated 6 months later, and Anna sounded more desperate. She was asking why Joseph hadn't written back, begging him to at least send word that he was safe and well. She wrote about how little Thomas had grown, how he was starting to talk in full sentences, and kept asking where Papa had gone. The third letter was from December 1965, and Anna's tone had completely changed. Mrs. Kowalczyk's voice grew soft as she translated Anna's words. She said she finally understood that he wasn't coming back home to them. She'd heard from other families in town about men who went to America and started completely new lives there. She said she wouldn't write any more letters because she could see that he'd made his choice about where he wanted to be. She hoped he was happy in his new life, and she prayed that someday little Tomasz would understand why his father never came home. I sat there in Mrs. Kowalczyk's warm kitchen, staring at these letters that had just completely rewritten everything I thought I knew about my family's history. My father hadn't come to America as a single man seeking opportunity and adventure. He'd left behind a wife and son who were counting on him to return. I had a brother. Somewhere in Poland, there was a man who shared my father's blood, who'd grown up without him. I told Mrs. Kowalczyk that there were more letters in that trunk, dozens of them. She looked at me with such compassion and said I needed to decide if I really wanted to know everything those letters might reveal. But deep down, I already knew I had no choice. That same afternoon, I brought over the entire collection of letters. But as the months dragged on, those hopeful letters grew more and more worried. Joseph had stopped writing regularly. The money he'd promised to send home became sporadic, then stopped coming altogether. Anna had to swallow her pride and move back in with her parents. She started taking in sewing work to support herself and little Thomas, working late into the night by lamplight. By 1964, she'd started hearing whispers and rumors around town. Other wives in similar situations had discovered that their husbands had remarried in America, abandoning their Polish families entirely. Anna began asking direct questions in her letters. Was there someone else? Was he planning to return at all? Did he still love them? The timeline Mrs. Kowalczyk was translating made my stomach turn. My father had met my mother in 1963, right around the time Anna's letters were becoming desperate. Dad and Mom were married in 1964, when Anna was still writing those heartbreaking letters, begging for news. I was born in 1965, and my younger brother Michael came along in 1967. The math was devastating. While Anna was pouring her heart out in those letters, pleading for any word from her husband, my father was busy building an entirely new family. He'd never bothered to divorce Anna. After all, who in America would ever know about a wife back in Poland? And divorce in Catholic Poland wasn't exactly easy to come by anyway. The very last letter was the most painful one to hear. Anna wrote that she'd finally accepted the truth about what had happened. Through mutual friends, she'd learned that Joseph was married to an American woman and had children with her. She said she would tell Tomasz that his father had died in an accident in America, because it would be kinder than explaining that his daddy had simply chosen to abandon them. "I loved you with my whole heart," she wrote in that final letter. "I believed every promise you made to me and our son. But I won't let our child spend his whole life waiting for someone who's never coming home. May God forgive you for what you've done to us, because I don't know if I ever can." I cried reading that letter. I cried for Anna, for little Tomasz who'd lost his father, and somehow I even cried for my own father, though I was furious with him at the same time. But mostly I cried because I realized that somewhere in Poland there was a 65-year-old man who thought his father had died when he was just a little boy. Over the next few weeks, I became completely obsessed with finding out what had happened to Anna and Tomasz after those letters stopped. Mrs. Kowalczyk helped me reach out to relatives still living in Poland, and through a network of family connections and old neighborhood friends, we managed to track down some information. We learned that Anna had eventually remarried in 1968 to a wonderful man named Stefan Nowak, who adopted little Tomasz and gave him his last name. Did I have any right to reach out to this man and potentially destroy the protective story his mother had so carefully built around his childhood? What would it do to a 65-year-old grandfather to suddenly learn that his father hadn't died heroically in America, but had simply walked away from his family without ever looking back? But then I kept thinking about those letters from Anna, about her incredible strength and the pain she'd endured in silence. She deserved better than what my father had done to her. And Tomasz deserved to know that he had family members who cared about him, even if we were all connected through someone who had hurt every single one of us. I decided to take a DNA test through one of those genealogy websites, hoping that maybe Tomasz had done the same thing. If he had, our connection would show up naturally in the system, and he could choose for himself whether or not he wanted to pursue contact with his American relatives. 3 long months later, I got an email notification that made my heart race. A close DNA match had been found. Someone who appeared to be a half-sibling. The profile name was simply T. Nowak, and he'd listed Poland as his location. When I opened his profile, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely click the mouse. He'd included a brief note that said, "Looking for any information about my biological father, Joseph Kowalski, who left for America in 1962 and never returned home. He was actively searching for my father. He'd been looking for answers just like I had been." I spent 3 full days crafting and recrafting a message to him. How do you tell someone that their father didn't die in an accident, but chose to disappear from their life? How do you explain to a complete stranger that they have a half-sister living in America who grew up with the father they never got to know? Finally, I decided to keep it simple and honest. "Hello, Tomasz. I believe Joseph Kowalski was my father too. I recently found letters from your mother, Anna, hidden in my parents' house. I think we need to talk." His response came back within just a few hours, and it nearly knocked me off my chair. I have been waiting my entire life for this message. We arranged a video call for the following weekend. When Tomasz appeared on my computer screen for the first time, It was like looking at a male version of myself. We had the same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting our heads slightly when we were thinking hard about something. But more than our physical resemblance, there was this immediate sense of recognition, of family, that I'd never expected to feel. Tomasz told me that his mother had always said his father died in a construction accident in America when he was very young. But as he got older, he started to suspect there might be more to the story. Tomasz told me about his life, how his stepfather Stefan had been absolutely wonderful to him, treating him exactly like his own flesh and blood, how he'd become a teacher because he wanted to help children who might be struggling like he had, how he'd always felt like there was this piece of his identity missing, but he could never quite put his finger on what it was. I shared stories about our father's life in America, trying to be honest but gentle at the same time. How Dad had worked hard at the steel mill and provided well for our family, but how he'd never talked about Poland beyond the most basic details. How he'd been a loving father to Michael and me, but apparently only because we were the children he'd chosen to acknowledge and raise. Tomasz asked me the question I'd been dreading. Do you think he ever regretted leaving us behind? I had to answer honestly that I just didn't know. He'd kept those letters from Anna for over 60 years, hidden away but not destroyed. So some part of him clearly couldn't forget about his first family completely. But he'd never once tried to contact Tomasz, not even after Anna had stopped writing those heartbreaking letters. Over the following months, Tomasz and I slowly built a real relationship through emails, video calls, and sharing family photographs. He sent me pictures of Anna, and I could instantly see why my father had fallen so deeply in love with her. She was absolutely beautiful, with the kindest eyes and the gentlest smile I'd ever seen. Tomasz shared stories about growing up in Krakow, about Stefan, who'd raised him with such love and patience, and about his own children and grandchildren, who filled his life with joy. I sent him photographs of our father from different periods of his American life, pictures from my high school graduation, of him walking me down the aisle at my wedding, of him holding his American grandchildren at Christmas morning celebrations. Tomasz studied these images so carefully, trying to reconcile them with his few scattered memories of the father who'd left when he was just a toddler. The most emotional moment came when Tomasz sent me a photograph I'd never seen before. It showed our father holding baby Tomasz, both of them smiling directly at the camera with such pure happiness. Anna must have taken it just before Joseph left for America, never knowing it would be the last picture of father and son together. Tomasz wrote that this was the only photograph he had of his father holding him as a baby. His mother had kept it hidden away all these years, but after she died, he'd found it tucked inside her jewelry box, along with his baby teeth and the hospital bracelet from when he was born. The area was old, but beautifully maintained, with narrow cobblestone streets and buildings that had clearly been standing there for generations. We stopped outside the apartment building that had been theirs, and Tomasz pointed up to a second-floor window where his mother used to sit every evening, watching and hoping for a letter carrier who might bring word from America. Together, we visited Anna's grave in a peaceful cemetery on the outskirts of the city. Her headstone was simple and dignified. Anna Nowak, beloved wife and mother, 1938 to 2019. There was no mention of her first marriage, no hint of the heartbreak she'd endured as a young woman. Tomasz had brought white roses, her favorite flowers, he told me. Standing there by her grave, Thomas said something that stayed with me. I used to be so angry with her for lying to me about my father, but now, having learned the real truth, I understand completely why she did it. She was protecting me from exactly the kind of pain I'm feeling right now. I placed my own flowers on Anna's grave and silently thanked her for raising the brother I'd never known existed. She'd been handed an impossible situation and had handled it with more grace and strength than anyone should ever have to find. That evening, I had dinner with Tomasz's entire family. His wife Maria was warm and welcoming, making me feel like I'd always been part of their lives. His 3 children, all adults now, with families of their own, were absolutely fascinated to meet their American aunt they'd never known about. We shared stories and laughter, and for the first time in my life, I felt connected to the Polish heritage that my father had kept hidden from us. Tomasz's oldest son was also named Józef, in honor of his grandfather, and he looked remarkably like our father had in those few young photographs I'd seen. When I mentioned this resemblance, the whole dinner table fell silent for a moment. Maria quietly explained that when their son was born, Tomasz's stepfather, Stefan, had suggested the name, saying they should honor a great man who died too young. They'd always assumed he meant his own father or some other family member. None of them had realized he was talking about the biological grandfather who'd abandoned his family. Even decades after his death, my father's secrets were still unraveling and affecting people's lives. On my last night in Krakow, Tomasz and I sat in a cozy cafe near the old town square, trying to make sense of everything we'd discovered about our family. I asked him directly if he hated our father for what he'd done. Tomasz thought about it for a long time before answering. He said he definitely hated the choices Dad had made. Hated that he'd hurt so many innocent people with his selfishness. Before I left Poland, Tomasz gave me the most precious gift I could imagine, a small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to Anna. Inside was the original of that photograph showing Dad holding baby Tomasz, along with a tiny lock of Tomasz's baby hair and the faded hospital bracelet from his birth. Tomasz said Anna had treasured these keepsakes her entire life, never throwing them away, despite everything that had happened. He believed she would have wanted me to have them, to help complete the picture of our father's true story. In return, I gave him copies of every single letter Anna had written to Dad, along with photographs showing our father's whole life in America. We made a pact that while we couldn't change or fix the past, we could choose how to handle the present and future. Flying back to Chicago, I found myself thinking about how complicated human beings really are. My father had been capable of tremendous love and terrible cruelty, sometimes toward the very same people. He'd built what looked like a good, honest life in America, but it was founded on the heartbreak and abandonment of his first family. Yet if he hadn't made those painful choices, I wouldn't have had the father I knew and loved growing up. Tomasz wouldn't have been raised by Stefan, who'd been such a wonderful stepfather to him. And most importantly, Tomasz and I never would have found each other. Across an ocean and 6 decades of family secrets, the hardest part was deciding what to tell my brother Michael. He'd always looked up to Dad and had his own precious memories to protect. After thinking about it for weeks, I decided he deserved to know the whole truth. He had a right to know about his other brother, and Tomasz deserved to be acknowledged by all of his siblings. Michael's reaction was similar to mine. Shock, anger, deep sadness, but ultimately acceptance of this new reality. He immediately started planning his own trip to Poland to meet Tomasz in person. Our family, which had been fractured by Dad's secrets and lies, was slowly healing itself around the truth. I still have all of Anna's letters. I've had every single one translated, and I read them sometimes when I'm trying to understand how people survive the worst kinds of betrayal and still find ways to build meaningful lives. Her words show such a clear progression from deep love to hope to desperation to resignation, and finally to incredible strength. She'd found a way to create something beautiful from the broken pieces our father had left behind. Tomasz and I talk regularly now, and our relationship grows stronger every month. He's planning to visit Chicago next year, and I've promised to show him the neighborhood where our father lived for 30 years, the church where he married my mother, and the steel mill where he worked until he retired. She could have filled Tomasz with bitterness and anger toward the father who'd abandoned them, but instead she gave him stability, love, and a peaceful childhood. Stefan, Tomasz's stepfather, welcomed another man's child as his own and never made him feel unwanted or different. And now all of us, the children and grandchildren of these complicated decisions, are writing a new chapter together. We can't change what happened in the past, but we can absolutely choose how we build our future as a family. Sometimes I imagine what might have happened if Dad had been honest from the very beginning, if he properly divorced Anna before marrying Mom, if he'd maintained some kind of relationship with Tomasz, sent money to help support him, stayed connected to his first son's life in some way. Maybe we would have had one big, complicated, but honest family stretching across the ocean. But those are just dreams and wishful thinking. The reality is that people are imperfect, that they make decisions based on fear or selfishness or simple human weakness. And those decisions create consequences that last for decades. All we can do is try to handle the legacy of those choices with more grace than the generation before us. Next month, I'm planning to take my own grandchildren to visit their grandfather's grave and tell them about their Polish uncle they'll be meeting soon. It's going to be a difficult conversation. How do you explain to children that the grandfather they remember as kind and loving also caused other people tremendous pain? But I think it's important for them to understand the complete truth about their family, both the good parts and the painful ones. Tomasz recently sent me a photograph from his old classroom where he'd been invited back as a guest teacher. In the picture, he's explaining something to a group of fascinated teenagers, and his face is glowing with the same kindness I used to see in Dad's eyes when he'd help me with my homework. It reminds me that people are so much more than their worst mistakes. Our father did a terrible thing by abandoning his first family, but he also raised children who grew up to be decent, caring people. Tomasz suffered from not having his biological father around, but he became a wonderful teacher and father himself. Maybe that's the real lesson here, that love and pain get woven together in family stories in the most complicated ways, and that healing comes not from forgetting the past, but from acknowledging it honestly and choosing to do better going forward. Every time I close that trunk with Anna's letters, I think about the young woman who wrote them, a new mother who loved so deeply and trusted so completely, who found the strength to keep going when her world completely fell apart.